Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Kirsty Varley, and I'm a partner in the housing litigation team at Forbes, specialising in antisocial behaviour. And thank you very much for attending today. There's a vast amount of information available about autism and the autistic spectrum, and we're finding more and more that mental health is increasingly an issue in cases that we deal with. So as I say, today we're going to focus on autism. And I've really tried to drill down on what I think are the most relevant parts for housing providers in this brief session that we've got. So we're going to look at autism, information about it, hints and tips for communicating with autistic tenants, autistic witnesses, and finally, dealing with autistic defendants. So, firstly, what is autism? Well, autism is a lifelong developmental disability, and it affects how people communicate and interact with the world. And around 1 in 100 people are on the autistic spectrum, and there are around 700,000 autistic adults and children in the UK. And autism is a spectrum condition, and it affects people in wholly different ways. And like all people, autistic people have their own strengths and weaknesses. So, obtaining a diagnosis of autism. Well, this often follows when a person has presented with persistent difficulties with social communication and social interaction, and also with restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviours, activities, or interests. And this can include sensory behaviour, often present since early childhood, and to the extent that these behaviours limit and impair the person's everyday functioning. And the terms autistic disorder, Asperger disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified have been replaced by the collective term autism spectrum disorder. So this means that it's likely that any person with autism spectrum disorder, that will be the most commonly given diagnosis from now on, rather than the other terms that were just mentioned. So there are specifiers that help clinicians to describe associated or additional conditions, and these can be things like intellectual impairment, language impairment, genetic conditions, behavioural disorders, and even catatonia. And the severity of the impairment of the autistic person's social communication can vary greatly. And the levels of severity are split into 3. So the lowest is simply requiring support, then requiring substantial support, and requiring very substantial support. And this will allow the clinician that's giving the diagnosis to give an indication of how much somebody's condition affects them and how much support they'll need. And severity levels can vary by context and also fluctuate over time. And this is much like we're used to in the housing field, seeing capacity being both decision specific and also capable of fluctuating. And the eligibility for and provision of services are developed at an individual level, and they're done through discussion with the autistic person to be asked about what their goals are, and they'll be supported over time to achieve them. So moving on to the impact of autism. Autistic brains take in vast amounts of information from the world, and many autistic people have considerable strengths, and these can include the ability to detect changes that others miss. They can involve great dedication and honesty, and also bring with it a deep sense of social justice. But because many autistic people feel as though they've been placed in a world where they are overwhelmed by pattern, colour, sound, smell, texture, and taste, often these strengths don't get the chance to be shown And instead, autistic people can feel as though that they're plunged into sensory crisis, and this can lead to either a display of extreme behaviour, which is known as a meltdown, or to an extreme state of physical and communication withdrawal, which is a shutdown. And I put on the slide there two terms, hypersensitive and hyposensitive. And hypersensitive, this relates to the external senses, and this means that autistic people normally get too much information from what's around them. So again, this is sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. And hyposensitive relates to the internal senses, and this means that the autistic person doesn't get enough from within their own bodies, such as balance, position, movement, and processing the feelings. And so this clearly creates an imbalance, and this can take real effort and cause people to become cognitively overloaded very quickly. And with a lack of awareness about how the person's being affected internally, this can lead to an overwhelming sensory and emotional overload. So moving on to autism awareness, well, perhaps fortuitously, this week is World Autism Acceptance Week, and it runs from the 28th of March right through to the 3rd of April 2022, and it's supported by the National Autistic Society in the UK, and they're running this awareness campaign, and the idea is to raise awareness and funds for agencies supporting autistic people, and this is to help the 700,000 autistic people in the UK and the families, and the National Autistic Society runs specialist schools, campaign for improved rights, and train companies on being more autism friendly, among many other things. So autism accreditation. Well, this again is run by the National Autistic Society, and this accreditation is available to organisations who've undergone the assessment, which gauges how they as an organisation meet the needs of autistic people who use their service. So it leads to a more autism focused service, increased expertise in supporting autistic people, and can form a foundation for informing strategic planning when dealing with autistic people, and also better outcomes, both for autistic people that the organisation supports and also potentially works with as well. So autism and learning disabilities. So as we've already established, autism is a spectrum disorder. So this means that autistic people can have varying support needs. But 1/3 of autistic people also have a learning disability. Some autistic people have high support needs, which may mean that they require full-time care and support. Some may need a bit less support with day-to-day activities only, and some live fully independent lives. And autistic people can have different degrees of learning disability, which can affect all aspects of their life, from studying in school to learning how to wash themselves or make a meal. And some will be able to live fairly independently, although they may need a degree of support to achieve this, while others may require lifelong specialist support. Some autistic people don't have any accompanying learning disabilities, but they can still have specific learning difficulties, such as dyslexia. And some autistic people are non-verbal or selectively mute, meaning that they don't speak, and others have difficulty communicating. And even though somebody may not use the spoken word or not use it in a way that others do, there are plenty of other ways to communicate. And some examples of these I've found when I was researching this session were social stories and comic strip conversations. And both social stories and comic strip conversations were created by a lady called Carol Gray. There's a lot of information about her online if you want to have a look at it. And both of these are short descriptions of a particular situation, event, or activity, which includes specific information about what to expect in that situation and why. It presents information in a very literal, concrete way, which can improve an autistic person's understanding of what's been a previously difficult or ambiguous situation or activity. And the presentation and content can be adapted to meet different people's needs. And they can help with sequencing, so that's what comes next in a series of activities. and executive functioning. So that's planning and organising. And comic strip conversations are very simple visual representations of a conversation, and they can show the things that are actually said in a conversation, how people might be feeling, and what people's intentions are. Comic strip conversations use stick figures and symbols to represent social interactions and abstract aspects of conversation, and colour to represent the emotional content of a statement or message. So looking at these in a bit more detail. Using social stories. If you're going to use social stories when you're speaking to an autistic person, you really need to think about ways to assist their comprehension. So for example, would adding questions help, or replacing some text with blanks for the person to fill in? Can you find ways to support the social story? So for example, help create a poster with a key phrase from the story to aid understanding and also assist them to remember. Plan how often and where the story will be shared with the person. Present the story to the person at a time when everyone is feeling calm and relaxed. That's really important. You need to monitor how well the story is received and whether it's working as intended. And if you're going to use them as an organisation to communicate with autistic tenants, keep the stories organised in a ring binder or a computer folder, and it would make them easier to find, review and develop with new information. So the example that I thought of was, if you're dealing with an autistic tenant, you need to speak to them about gaining access to the property. You could say to them, I've written this story for you. This is about the repairs that are going to be done in your property next week. Let's read it together now. It's a very simple example, but I think it illustrates it quite well. So looking now at comic strip conversations. Well, these can help autistic people understand concepts that they otherwise would find particularly difficult. So making the person feel comfortable is key. So you'd start with small talk. You'd ask a range of questions about a specific situation or a type of social interaction. And the idea is that people draw as they talk, and then they use these drawings to learn about different social situations. And in a comic strip conversation, the autistic person takes the lead role. So you'd summarise the event or situation that you've discussed using the drawings as a guide. You think about how you can address any problems or concerns that have been identified. It can really help the person that you're supporting to become familiar both with the drawing and the concept that the drawing is about while you're doing it, and also to mimic ordinary social interactions that might otherwise be difficult and overwhelming for the autistic person. And comic strip conversations can be used to plan for situations in the future that might cause anxiety or concern, and then action plans can be developed to help the autistic person to deal with that. Visual supports. So visual supports are a communication tool that can be used with autistic people. They can be used in most situations. They're adaptable, they're portable, they can help to provide structure and routine. They can encourage independence, help to build confidence, improve understanding, avoid frustration and anxiety, and provide opportunities to interact with one another. And there really are lots of pictures that can be downloaded or bought, both as printed images, and there are even apps that can be downloaded now to assist with this. So there are lots of visual aids and supports out there. So moving on a bit more specifically to having autistic people as tenants, given that we are focusing really on registered providers, I thought that was a sensible route to go down. So there are some specialist housing and support providers for people with autism, and I've already mentioned the National Autistic Society, and they have both residential and supported living services for people with autism. The criteria for admission to their particular service is that a person has to be over 18. They have to have a diagnosis of autism, And crucially, they already have to have funding in place to be able to pay for the service. So clearly, agencies such as social services and local mental health teams will be key in securing this. Many autistic people, however, don't have that level of care and have unpaid carers. And if that's the case, as a housing provider, if you're aware that your tenant's autistic, you really need to think about whether they've got any support in place. And remember, housing needs must be considered by law as part of any Care Act assessment that's done. Any support needs and relevant funding to meet those needs should be identified at the point that the Care Act assessment is undertaken. And anybody can make a referral for a Care Act assessment to the local authority. So if as a registered provider you think one should be done, you've got the ability to make that referral. So dealing with autistic people as tenants. Well, if you've got an autistic tenant, you really need to make sure that you're aware of the support that they need to sustain the tenancy. So do your homework. What is their preferred method of communication? Are there any needs around that? For example, do you need to write to the tenant on a certain colour paper to help them to retain the information and understand what's being said? If you're going to arrange a face-to-face meeting with an autistic person and you want to make sure you've got the person's attention, it's advised that you say their name before you speak to them, because that will direct their attention to you when you're talking to them. If you're going to arrange a date or time for a meeting, be specific. Try not to say between 8 and 1, for example. Give a time, because that will reduce the autistic person's anxiety. And if you do agree a date and time for a meeting, you really need to stick to that as much as possible. And if you're unable to attend, you need to give the autistic person as much notice as possible and try and rearrange with another firm date. When you're at the meeting, you need to explain fully the purpose of the meeting so that they understand why they're there, and you may need to revisit that. You also need to avoid using jargon for them. And also in the meeting, you need to give them time to process the information. You may need to have more than one meeting. And if you're going to write any follow-up correspondence, you need to make sure that you give a clear and concise list of agreed points and remove any ambiguity at all, because that in itself can cause stress and anxiety. And finally, consider a single point of contact. This can be beneficial to the autistic person and also the housing provider. This will allow the autistic person, the single point of contact to attend any relevant autism awareness training. And it will allow them to build a rapport with the autistic tenant that might be impossible for other individuals who deal with them on an incidental basis within the organisation. So now moving on to antisocial behaviour and autism. There's quite a lot of information around this, so I thought it was worth spending a bit of time on it. So as we would with any antisocial behaviour case, evidence gathering, of course, is the first port of call and is going to be key. And gathering evidence and information from an autistic witness, you'd need to bear in mind the points that are made in relation to the last slide about giving the person time to speak to you, getting their attention, making them comfortable. And you also need to bear in mind, as I've just said, it might not be possible to get all of the information that you need in one interview. And you may need to do more than one session just to build up familiarity with the person. Get advice about the best approach to speak to the person. So talk to the person's family, carers, or professionals who know them well, and seek advice on the best way to interview them. You need to ensure the witness is comfortable when you're speaking to them, so it might be an idea to speak to them in their own home or ask them where they would prefer to be spoken to and if they want somebody with them. It might be necessary to seek advice from a psychologist who specialises in autism spectrum disorder. When you do speak to the person, you want to remove any unnecessary distractions. So, for example, you need to think about where you're going to sit the person in the room, ensure that there are no background noises, bright lights, or too many objects in the room that could distract them during the interview. Sit them with the back facing the window, and don't expect them to make eye contact. That can be something that can be quite difficult, especially if they're talking about a subject that has caused them some distress or some anxiety. And finally, the person with autism may have an attachment to a particular object and want to bring that with them to the interview. And if they do, you should let them do that. This can help them to concentrate, and removing the object can cause unnecessary distress. And the last point on the slide relates to court appearances. Now, if you're going to take evidence from an autistic witness, there's a chance that this may need to be used in court proceedings, and this is something that needs to be thought about very carefully. So first of all, is this going to be something that is feasible? Can the autistic person, will they be able medically to give evidence in court? If they won't, you might need to consider a hearsay notice, and you would need to back that up with medical evidence as to why the actual process of giving live evidence in court would be too much for that person. So that will be something that you need to think about as soon as you're taking evidence from a witness. If you are going to ask the autistic person to give evidence in court, well, the county court has a wide range of case management powers available. And if witnesses need special measures, for example, these should usually be raised at the directions stage. And in relation to the case management powers, having looked at them, probably the most relevant for housing purposes, if we're looking at litigation, they would be the court's power to control evidence, the power to permit evidence by video link, and the court's more wide use of technology generally. So first, looking at the court's power to control evidence, Civil Procedure Rule 32.1 states that the court can control evidence by giving directions as to the issues on which it requires evidence, the nature of the evidence that the court requires to decide those issues, and finally, the way in which evidence is placed before the court. And the court can also exclude evidence that would otherwise be admissible, and it may limit cross-examination. So there's some really key points there. And again, thinking about the special measures, is this something that you want to look at? I had an autistic witness once who gave live evidence in court from behind a screen, and this witness was absolutely terrified of the defendant but wanted to give live evidence, but couldn't cope with making eye contact with seeing the defendant in question. And after liaising with the court, we managed to secure the witness's own routes in and out of the courtroom via some of the judges' rooms and then round to behind the screen. So this avoided the witness having to see or make eye contact with the defendant, and that worked very well. CPR 32.3 states that a court may allow a witness to give evidence by video link. So again, this is another measure that could be considered if the autistic person is able to give evidence, but the actual experience of being physically present in a courtroom, again, we've touched on earlier on the sensory overload and the impact that can have. If that would be too much and you can obtain medical evidence to support that, that could be something, again, that is raised at direction stage. And then more generally, the courts can provide documents taking into account any reasonable adjustments. So any information about needs of an autistic witness should be drawn to the court's attention if the court needs to write to them in any way. And again, we've talked about using different coloured paper and things like that. Any reasonable adjustments that the landlord will be expected to make, these should be drawn to the attention of the court so that the court can make these as well. And then finally, we've looked at autistic people as tenants generally. We've looked at autistic people as victims and/or witnesses. So finally, this slide considers the unfortunate event where you're faced with complaints of antisocial behaviour against an autistic tenant. And before I say any more, I should point out that all of the special measures that are available for witnesses, some of which I touched on the previous slide, are available for autistic defendants as well. And any reasonable adjustments that are available will be based on the person's need, not on the person's role within proceedings. So that must be kept in the forefront of mind if you're thinking about autistic people in litigation. And the first point on the slide is the Equality Act 2010. And this is relevant to any occasion, actually, when you're dealing with an autistic person, not just when the autistic person is a defendant. And just as a reminder, Section 149 of the Equality Act is the public sector equality duty, and this states that a public authority must, in the exercise of its functions, have due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, harassment, victimisation, and any other conduct that's prohibited under the Act. Advance equality of opportunity between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic and persons who don't share it. And foster good relations between persons who share a relevant protected characteristic and persons who don't share it. And as housing providers, you're exercising public functions by allocating and managing social housing. And so you are judged to be a public authority for these purposes. So you are caught by the public sector equality duty, and this is something that needs to be factored in. Now, I've mentioned on the slide an Equality Act review, and really the public sector equality duty really requires housing providers to think about the autistic person's needs, whether any of the behaviour that's complained of is linked to or is as a result of their autism. And I would recommend very, very detailed Equality Act reviews. I once dealt with an autistic defendant, and there were a total of 4 Equality Act reviews done in proceedings, one at the start before proceedings were issued, and then subsequent ones following a psychiatric report, and then 2 addendum reports following questions that we posed to the psychiatrist. So really keeping the rationale for your decision making up to date based on the most recent information that you have about the person and their diagnosis and their needs and any reasonable adjustments is absolutely crucial. And I've mentioned again, a single point of contact. If this isn't something that can be put in place by agreement, it can be ordered by the court. And in fact, the case I've just referred to, it was ordered by the court as a means of the tenant communicating with the housing provider. And as far as I'm aware, the order's been beneficial both to the housing provider in managing the conduct with the defendant and also to the tenant, who I understand has complied with it to date. And finally, training. Would your organisation benefit from autism awareness training? Are there certain individuals like single points of contact who deal with autistic tenants who should have this training? There are so many resources out there and so many courses actually. And increasingly, I think courts are going to expect housing providers to have really thought about this when dealing with autistic people and particularly autistic defendants. Right, well, I think that's everything. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. It's been a really interesting topic for me to look at, and if you think of anything else once the session's finished, please feel free to drop me a line. I've just put my details on the screen there. I'll leave them up there for a moment or so. And other than that, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.